On your knees! I said, on your knees! The shout cracked through the stale, humid air of the warehouse, accompanied by the distinct metallic slide of an AK-47 charging handle. Dust motes danced in the single beam of harsh halogen light cutting through the gloom. Sarah didn't move immediately. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, her hands raised slowly, palms open, fingers relaxed. Blood trickled from a cut above her eyebrow, blinding her left eye, but her right eye was fixed on the insurgent leader, a man named Cale, who was sweating despite the cool night air. "You Americans," Cale spat, stepping closer, the muzzle of his rifle inches from her forehead. "You think you are untouchable, but here you are nothing, just currency." Sarah's lips curled. It started as a low huff of breath, then a chuckle, and finally a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. It was a sound devoid of humor, filled instead with a terrifying pity. Cal frowned, unnerved. "You find death funny, woman?" "No," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, steady as a granite slab. "I find you funny. You just told a Navy SEAL to surrender." She watched his eyes widen, the realization hitting him a fraction of a second too late. 7 seconds, she whispered. Transmission breaks. Static. 48 hours earlier, Port of Al-Fayed. The heat in Al-Fayed wasn't just temperature. It was a physical weight, smelling of diesel fumes, roasting meat, and open sewage. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Sterling adjusted the oversized sunglasses on her nose, her eyes scanning the chaotic tapestry of the marketplace through the tinted lenses. To the casual observer, she was just another private security contractor, PSD, hired to babysit a mid-level NGO diplomat named Julian Thorne. She wore faded cargo pants, a nondescript gray t-shirt that concealed the compact Sig Sauer P320 at her appendix, and a checkered shima draped loosely around her neck. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to watch. "Package is moving to the vehicle," Sterling murmured, her voice barely audible. The comms earpiece, hidden under her hair, crackled with a response from Overwatch. "Copy, Viper. Drone feed shows increased heat signatures 2 blocks east. A bottleneck is forming at the intersection of Market and 3rd. Advise reroute." "Negative on reroute," Sterling replied, her eyes locking onto a rusted Toyota Hilux, inching too close to their armored SUV. "Local drivers are aggressive today. If we divert, we signal fear. Keep the lane." She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, opening the rear door of the armored Land Cruiser for Thorne. The diplomat, a man more accustomed to boardrooms than war zones, looked pale. "Sarah, are we safe?" Thorne asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Get inside, sir. Keep your head down," she said. Her tone was professional, devoid of comfort, but rich in authority. As she rounded the vehicle to the passenger side, the atmosphere shifted. It was a subtle change, the sudden silence of the street vendors, the way a group of military-aged males on the corner stopped talking and turned in unison. Pre-contact indicators. Sterling's hand drifted toward her waistline, mere inches from the grip of her pistol. Her heart rate slowed, dropping into the rhythmic, controlled beat of a predator entering the kill zone. Boom! The explosion didn't come from an RPG. It was an IED buried in a trash pile 10 meters ahead. The concussion wave hit the Land Cruiser like a sledgehammer, lifting the 2-ton beast onto 2 wheels before it slammed back down, shattering the reinforced glass into a spiderweb of white cracks. Ear-ringing. Dust everywhere. "Ambush!" Sterling shouted, though she couldn't hear her own voice. She wasn't disoriented. While Thorne screamed in the back seat, Sterling was already calculating. Front. Blocked by burning debris. Rear. A heavy truck had just pulled up, boxing them in. Left and right, fatal funnels. Through the settling dust, silhouettes emerged. 5, 6, 10 of them. Militia, not professional soldiers, but dangerous in their numbers and erratic behavior. They weren't firing to kill. They were firing into the air. They wanted the vehicle. They wanted the occupants. Sterling drew her weapon, clicking the safety off. She could drop 3 of them before they cleared the smoke. She could exit the vehicle, use the engine block as cover, and fight until her 3 mags ran dry. But then she looked at Thorne. He was curled in a fetal position, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. If a firefight started, the rounds would punch through the compromised armor. He would die. Viper, status. We are detecting. The comms cut out, jammed. They were on their own. A rifle butt smashed against her window. The glass held but barely. A man with a scarred face screamed at her, gesturing for her to open the door. Sterling looked at the man, then at her gun. She had a choice. Go down fighting in a blaze of glory, the SEAL way, or survive long enough to find an opening. If she fought now, she died. And Thorne died. If she surrendered, she entered the belly of the beast. She exhaled, a long, slow breath that expelled the adrenaline shaking her hands. She clicked the safety back on. She holstered the weapon. Raising her hand slowly, she unlocked the door. Don't look like a soldier, she told herself. Look like a secretary. Look afraid. She pushed the door open and stumbled out, deliberately tripping over her own feet to appear clumsy. The heat of the day rushed in, carrying the smell of cordite and sweat. Please, she cried out, pitching her voice high and frantic. Don't shoot. We are civilians. Rough hands grabbed her, wrenching her arms behind her back. A zip tie bit into her wrists, tight enough to cut circulation. She let out a sob, a calculated performance, as they dragged her away from the vehicle. But as they shoved her face first into the dirt, Sterling's eyes were wide open, staring at the boots of her captors, counting them, analyzing their weapons, their spacing, their discipline. Mistake number 1, she thought, the ghost of a smile hidden in the dirt. You didn't search me properly. Darkness hit Sarah with the force of a suffocating blanket. The burlap hood shoved over her head smelled of gasoline, dried earth, and stale sweat. It was coarse against her skin, scratching the fresh cut above her eye. But the physical discomfort was secondary to the data stream running through her mind. She was thrown, not placed, into the bed of a pickup truck. Her shoulders slammed against the corrugated metal floor, sending a shock wave of pain down her arm. Beside her, she heard a sickening thud and a sharp cry. Thorne. Silence! A voice barked from above. A boot connected with Sarah's ribs. She curled instinctively, not just to protect her organs, but to sell the image. She let out a sharp, jagged gasp, shrinking away from the kick. Good, she thought. I am small. I am broken. I am not a threat. The engine roared to life, a diesel rattle that vibrated through the metal beneath her cheek. The truck lurched forward. Timer start. Sarah closed her eyes beneath the hood, shutting out the chaos to focus entirely on the motion. The truck accelerated. First gear, second, 1001, 1002, 1003. The vehicle banked hard to the left. Sarah's body slid across the bed, colliding with a spare tire. West, she noted, leaving the market district. Paved road, speed approximately 40 kph. Thorne was sobbing now, a low rhythmic keen of pure terror. Oh God, they're going to kill us. Shut up. A rifle butt slammed into the metal bed near Thorne's head. Sarah reached out with her bound hands, her fingers brushing Thorne's trembling arm. It was a gesture of comfort to him, but a tactical move for her. She needed to gauge his physical state. He was shaking violently, shock setting in. If he panicked and tried to fight, they would execute him right here in the truck. Please, Sarah whispered, pitching her voice to tremble. Just be quiet, please. The truck slowed. Gravel crunched under the tires. Transition to unpaved surface. 2 minutes, 10 seconds from the main road. Heading north-northwest. The air quality changed. Even through the thick weave of the burlap, the heavy, cloying scent of the city, spices, exhaust, sewage, was being replaced by something sharper. Salt, brine, and underneath that, the distinct copper tang of rotting fish. They were heading toward the coast. Sarah ran the mental map of Al-Fayed she had memorized weeks ago. North of the city lay the industrial sector. Most of it was abandoned after the port bombings 3 years ago. There were only a few structures large enough to house a militia group of the size that ambushed them. The old cannery. It was a tactical nightmare. Thick concrete walls, underground cooling tunnels, and isolated from the main grid. Perfect for hiding hostages. Perfect for making people disappear. The truck screeched to a halt. The engine died, leaving a ringing silence that was quickly filled by the sound of heavy sliding doors opening, metal grinding on rusted tracks. Rough hands grabbed her ankles. She was hauled out of the truck bed like a sack of grain, hitting the concrete floor hard. Her knees took the brunt of the impact, skin tearing through her cargo pants. "Get up," someone hissed in broken English. She struggled to her feet, swaying deliberately. She felt the muzzle of a weapon press into the small of her back. "Move!" She shuffled forward, counting her steps. 10 steps. The air grew cooler, damper. An echo. They were inside a large cavernous space. "Where are you taking us?" Thorne screamed, his composure finally shattering. "I am a diplomat. You can't—" The sound of the strike was wet and heavy. Thorne's voice cut off instantly, replaced by the sound of a body hitting the floor. Sarah froze. Her instincts screamed at her to drop her center of gravity, pivot, and drive her elbow into the attacker's throat. She could hear the guard's breathing. He was close, careless, likely distracted by Thorne. It would take less than 2 seconds to kill him. But there were others. She heard at least 4 distinct voices, and she was still blind. She forced herself to stand still, trembling, making herself look small. "Pick him up," a deep voice commanded. This one carried authority. Kale. She recognized the timbre from the shouting at the ambush site. Thorne was dragged past her, groaning. "And the woman?" a younger voice asked. "Bring her," Kale replied. "She might be worth something. If nothing else, the men will need entertainment." The threat hung in the damp air, heavy and explicit. Sarah felt a cold spike of adrenaline, but she pushed it down into the furnace of her resolve. They saw a victim. They saw a toy. They didn't know they had just brought a Tier 1 operator inside their perimeter. "Keep walking," she told herself, counting the steps down a flight of stairs. 12 steps, landing, left turn, iron door. She was in. Now the real work began. The hood was ripped off, dragging hair with it. Light exploded into Sarah's retinas, harsh, artificial, and blinding. She blinked rapidly, tears streaming down her face, partially involuntary from the brightness, partially manufactured. She needed to see, and she needed to see now. She was in a basement. The walls were damp cinder block, stained with years of grime and mold. The air was colder here, smelling of standing water and human misery. To her left, 2 guards were dragging a kicking, screaming Thorne through a heavy steel door. "No, I have diplomatic—" "Immunity!" Thorne shrieked. "You can't do this!" "Shut up!" a guard muttered, striking Thorne across the mouth with the back of his hand. The door slammed shut, cutting off the diplomat's protests with a finality that echoed in the small chamber. Sarah was alone with 3 men. She stood shivering in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. It wasn't just an act. The adrenaline dump had left her cold, but she amplified the tremors, making her teeth chatter audibly. She hunched her shoulders, rounding her spine to minimize her height, hiding the definition of her trapezius muscles. Dead giveaways of a shooter, not a secretary. This one. The guard who had removed her hood grunted, looking her up and down with a leering grin. He was older, heavy-set, with a PKM machine gun slung lazily over his shoulder. Check her for weapons, then check her for other things. Sarah's stomach tightened. She had a ceramic razor blade sewn into the hem of her cargo pants and a micro-tracker embedded in the heel of her left boot. A pat-down might miss them. A strip search would not. The younger guard stepped forward, his rifle dangling by its strap. He reached for the waistband of her pants. Distance, 2 feet. Stance, unbalanced. Threat level, low. She could snap his wrist and drive his own knife into his jugular before the heavy-set guard could lift his machine gun. The solution flashed in her mind like a red targeting reticle. No, if she killed him, she killed Thorne. She killed the mission. She had to be weak. She had to be disgusting. As the guard's fingers grazed her hip, Sarah unhinged her control. She let out a high, keening wail, sucking in air in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. She threw herself backward, scrambling away from him until her back hit the damp wall, sliding down into a huddled ball. "Please, don't touch me. I'm sick. Please, I'm sick," she screamed, rocking back and forth violently. The guard paused, annoyed. "Get up." Sarah forced the bile rising in her throat to the surface. She gagged, a wet, retching sound, and spat a mouthful of saliva and bile onto the concrete floor inches from the guard's boot. She heaved again, her body convulsing, snot running freely from her nose. She clawed at her own face, scratching the skin, eyes wide and rolling. "I have the fever," she shrieked, switching to broken Arabic, a dialect common to the plague-ridden refugee camps in the south. "Don't touch me!" The young guard recoiled, stepping back with a grimace of pure revulsion. In this region, disease was feared more than bullets. A woman who was hysterical, vomiting, and possibly contagious was not a prize. She was a liability. "Ugh, filthy bitch!" the guard spat, wiping his boot on the ground. He looked at the older man. "I'm not touching that." The older guard sneered, losing interest instantly. The allure was gone. "Fine. Throw her in the pit with the others. Let them deal with the smell." They didn't search her. They didn't check her boots. They didn't notice the calluses on her trigger finger or the scar tissue from shrapnel on her forearm. They just saw a broken, sick woman. The younger guard grabbed her by the back of her shirt, keeping his distance, and hauled her toward a barred gate at the far end of the room. He unlocked it with a heavy iron key and shoved her through. Sarah stumbled, falling onto a pile of dirty straw and rags. The gate slammed shut behind her. The lock clicked. "Enjoy your stay," the guard laughed, turning his back and walking away. Sarah lay face down in the straw for a full minute, waiting until the echo of their footsteps faded up the stairs. Slowly, the convulsions stopped. The sobbing ceased. She wiped her face with her sleeve, the movement precise and efficient. She rolled over and sat up. Her eyes were dry, cold, and scanning the darkness. She was in a large holding cell, roughly 20 by 20 feet. In the shadows, huddled against the far walls, were shapes. Civilians. Maybe a dozen of them. They were staring at her with a mixture of pity and fear. Sarah checked her boot heel. The tracker was still there. She checked her waistband. The ceramic blade was secure. She had survived the filter. Now she was in the system. "Are you okay?" A soft voice whispered from the darkness. A woman. Sarah looked at the shadowy figure. She allowed her shoulders to slump again, keeping the mask in place for now. I don't know," Sarah whispered back, her voice trembling. But inside, Lieutenant Commander Sterling was already marking the structural weak points of the gate hinges. The cell was a study in despair. 12 people. 3 women, 9 men, all locals, likely shopkeepers, fishermen, or laborers snatched from the wrong place at the wrong time. They were huddled in small, terrified clusters, their eyes wide and gleaming in the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline that had gone sour. Sarah remained in her corner, her back against the damp stone. She had stopped shivering. Her eyes, no longer feigning illness, were busy cataloging the assets in the room. Asset 1, a large man in the corner, weeping silently, useless. Asset 2, a young woman holding a rosary, focused but fragile. Asset 3, the heavy iron grate on the floor, drainage welded shut. We have to do something. The shout shattered the fragile silence. A man in a torn linen suit, a businessman, by the look of his soft hands and expensive watch, scrambled to his feet. He was pacing frantically, sweat pouring down his face. "They're going to kill us," the man babbled, his voice rising in pitch. "I have money. I can pay them. Why aren't they coming to negotiate?" "Sit down," an old man whispered hoarsely. "You will bring them back." "No." The businessman spun around, his eyes wild. He rushed toward the cell door, grabbing the iron bars. "Guard! Guard! I demand to speak to your commander. I am Ahmed Al-Jamil. I have money." The sound of his shouting echoed down the corridor outside. Sarah felt a cold spike of irritation. This was the most dangerous moment in captivity, the initial panic phase. If he kept screaming, the guards wouldn't come to negotiate. They would come to beat him into silence, and they wouldn't stop with him. Collateral damage was inevitable. "Guard!" Ahmed screamed again, shaking the door. Sarah moved. She didn't stand up like a hero. She didn't announce her intentions. She uncoiled from the floor like a spring releasing tension, covering the 15 feet between them in 3 silent, fluid strides. As Ahmed drew breath for another scream, Sarah was already behind him. She kicked the back of his knee, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to buckle the joint. As he collapsed backward, she slid her right arm around his neck, locking her bicep against his carotid artery. Her left hand grabbed her right bicep, cementing the hold. A rear naked choke, blood choke. "Shh," she whispered directly into his ear, her voice devoid of anger. It was the soothing, terrifying tone of a mother quieting a child before a storm. Ahmed flailed, his hands clawing at her forearm. He was larger than her, heavier by at least 50 pounds, but leverage and anatomy didn't care about weight. Sarah tightened the vise, compressing the arteries, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. "Don't fight," she murmured. "Go to sleep." The other hostages gasped, shrinking back against the walls. To them, it looked like murder. To Sarah, it was simple mechanics. 6 seconds to unconsciousness. Ahmed's struggles weakened. His hands dropped. His body went limp, dead weight against her chest. Sarah released the hold immediately, lowering him gently to the filthy concrete floor so his head wouldn't crack against the stone. She checked his pulse, strong and steady. He was out, not dead. She stood up and turned to face the room. The silence was absolute. 12 pairs of eyes stared at her. They no longer saw the sick, vomiting woman who had been thrown in minutes ago. They saw something else. Something dangerous. "He was going to get us all killed," Sarah said. Her English was accented with the local dialect she had perfected over months of deep cover. She kept her voice low, authoritative. "The guards outside, they don't want money. They want silence. If you scream, they hurt you. If you fight, they kill you." She looked at the young woman with the rosary. "You, what is your name?" "Layla," the woman stammered. "Layla, when he wakes up, tell him to stay down. If he screams again, I will put him back to sleep. Do you understand?" Layla nodded, eyes wide. Sarah retreated back to her corner, sinking down into the shadows. She didn't want to be a leader. Leadership made you a target, but she needed order. She wrapped her arms around her knees, returning to the guise of the frightened victim. But the dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. They gave her space now, a radius of respect. Phase 1 complete, she thought, staring at the dark outline of the door. Internal perimeter secured. Now she had to deal with the monsters outside. Time in the cell did not move in hours or minutes. It moved in the slow, agonizing creep of shadows across the damp floor and the rhythmic thud of boots on the ceiling above. While the other hostages eventually succumbed to exhaustion, collapsing into fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep, Sarah remained awake. She sat with her back against the cold stone wall, knees drawn up, eyes half closed to simulate rest. But beneath her lashes, her pupils were dilated, tracking every change in the environment. She was building a database. 200 Zulu, estimated. The heavy steel door at the top of the stairs opened. Heavy footsteps descended. 3 sets. Sarah didn't need to see them to know who they were. She had spent the last 6 hours profiling them by sound alone. First was the heavy. His gait was uneven, favoring the right leg. He dragged his heels slightly. He carried the PKM. She could hear the metallic rattle of the ammo belt hitting the receiver with every step. He checked the cell door every 45 minutes like clockwork. He was disciplined, but bored. Second was the leader, Kyle. His steps were brisk, purposeful. He didn't patrol. He inspected. He came down unpredictably, sometimes yelling orders, sometimes just standing in the dark corridor, listening. He was the variable, the danger. Third was the kid. Sarah shifted her head slightly, pressing her ear against a crack in the masonry that acted as an acoustic amplifier. The kid walked with a scuffing sound, likely wearing sneakers or ill-fitting boots. He hummed to himself, a quiet, nervous sound. He smelled of cheap tobacco and anxiety. Click hiss, the sound of a lighter being struck. Smoke drifted through the barred window high on the wall. Sarah began to count. 1, 2, 3. At count 30, the kid coughed. At count 60, he paced away from the door. He was the outlier. The heavy and Kale stayed at their posts or moved with purpose. The kid wandered. He violated light discipline by checking his phone. Sarah had seen the blue glow reflecting off the corridor wall 3 times in the last hour. Tactical assessment. The kid was bored, untrained, and likely conscripted. He didn't want to be here. This was the crack in the armor. Sarah closed her eyes, visualizing the rotation. Rotation, Alpha. The heavy walks the perimeter. Duration, 4 minutes. Rotation, Bravo. Kale checks the upper floor. Duration, variable. Rotation. Charlie. The kid guards the stairwell. Duration, 15 minutes. During rotation. Charlie, the observation gap was significant. The kid consistently drifted 5 meters away from the cell door to smoke near the ventilation shaft, leaving the immediate visual field of the cell unmonitored for approximately 90 seconds at a time. 90 seconds was a lifetime. "You are not sleeping," a whisper broke her concentration. Sarah opened one eye. It was Ahmed, the businessman she had choked out earlier. He was rubbing his neck, watching her with a mixture of fear and awe. He kept his distance, crouching 4 feet away. "Sleep is a luxury," Sarah replied quietly, her voice flat. "You should rest. You will need your strength." "Who are you?" Ahmed asked, his voice barely audible. "You're not a secretary. I saw how you moved." "My bodyguard? He was ex-military. He didn't move like that." Sarah turned her head slowly to look at him. The shadows hid her eyes, turning them into dark pools. "I am whatever I need to be to get us out of here," she said. "But if you ask me that again, or if you tell anyone what you think you saw, I can't help you." It was a necessary lie. If the civilians knew she was a SEAL, They would look to her for salvation too early. They would act differently, hopeful, defiant. The guards would notice the change in morale. Hope was dangerous right now. Despair was the perfect camouflage. Ahmed swallowed hard and nodded. I understand. Good. Now watch the window, Sarah ordered softly. Tell me when the blue light flashes again. The blue light? The guard's phone. He checks it every time he smokes. Ahmed looked confused but shifted his gaze to the high, barred window. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then a faint azure glow illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. Now, Ahmed whispered. Sarah closed her eyes again, restarting her internal chronograph. Mark. The kid was checking messages, distracted. His night vision would be ruined for the next 2 minutes after looking at the screen. His situational awareness was effectively zero. Sarah cataloged the data point. She didn't have a weapon yet. She didn't have a key, but she had the schedule. She knew exactly when the enemy was blind. She looked at her hands. They were covered in grime, the nails broken, but they were steady. 90 seconds, she thought. I can kill a lot of people in 90 seconds. The cell door crashed open, the sound reverberating like a gunshot in the confined space. Before the echoes died, the heavy was inside. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed Sarah by the hair, hauling her to her feet with a brutal efficiency that elicited a collective gasp from the other hostages. No, please, Sarah shrieked, her hands flying up to claw ineffectually at his grip. It was a performance, loud and desperate, designed to mask the fact that she was already shifting her weight to protect her neck from whiplash. He dragged her out, her boots scraping against the concrete, past the kid who watched with wide, nervous eyes, and up the stairs. They didn't take her far. A heavy steel door at the end of the corridor opened into a small, windowless room. In the center sat a single wooden chair bolted to the floor. Above it, a naked bulb swung on a wire, casting oscillating shadows against the peeling paint. Kyle was waiting. He leaned against a metal table, cleaning his fingernails with a combat knife. Sit, Kyle commanded. The heavy threw her into the chair. He didn't tie her down. That was a specific choice. Psychological. It suggested they didn't fear her running. They knew she had nowhere to go. Sarah huddled in the chair, pulling her knees to her chest, trembling. She kept her head down, letting her hair obscure her face. Look at me, Cale said softly. When she didn't move fast enough, he stepped forward and grabbed her chin, forcing her head up. His fingers dug into her jawline. He smelled of sandalwood and stale tobacco. Your boss, Mr. Thorne, Cale began, his voice conversational. He says he is a diplomat, but his laptop, it has encryption that my tech specialist cannot break. Diplomats' laptops do not have military-grade firewalls. Who is he really? I don't know, Sarah stammered, tears leaking from her eyes. He's with the NGO, supply chains, food, medicine. I just manage the schedules. Cale sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. Sarah, that is your name, yes? Sarah, you are lying to me. He didn't wind up. He didn't shout. He simply backhanded her across the face. The blow was heavy, delivered with the weight of his upper body. It snapped Sarah's head to the side. The skin of her cheek split against her teeth. The metallic tang of blood flooded her mouth instantly. Damage assessment, her mind whispered coolly, detached from the throbbing pain. Buccal mucosa lacerated, no loose teeth, jaw hinge intact, mild concussion probable. Externally, she let out a choked sob, bringing her hand up to cover her face. Please, I don't know anything. We found the tracker in your boot, Kyle said, watching her reaction closely. Sarah froze. This was the test. If she reacted with military stoicism, she was burned. If she denied it too perfectly, she was burned. Tracker? She blinked, confusion warring with pain in her expression. My boots. The company gave them to me for insurance. Because of the kidnappings last year, they track the vehicles. It was a partial truth, the best kind of lie. Cale studied her. He stepped closer, looming over her. You are not a secretary. You don't scream right. He drove a fist into her solar plexus. It was a crippling blow. For a normal civilian, it would have collapsed the diaphragm, causing instant panic and paralysis. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. Her vision grayed at the edges. Her body wanted to curl up and die. But Viper took over. She forced her diaphragm to spasm in a controlled manner, fighting the paralysis. She fell off the chair, curling into a ball on the floor, gasping for air. Loud, retching gasps that sounded like dying, but were actually mechanically pulling oxygen back into her blood. She lay there, drooling blood onto the concrete, shaking. Cale crouched down beside her. He grabbed her hair again, pulling her face inches from his. He was looking for the fear. He was looking for the pleading, the bargaining, the "I'll do anything." Sarah looked back at him. She let the tears fall. She let her lip tremble. But deep in her pupils, behind the watery veil of pain, there was nothing. No bargaining, no hysteria. Just a flat, endless void. She wasn't begging for her life because, in her mind, she was already dead. She was just waiting for him to make a mistake. For a second, Cale saw it. He saw the abyss staring back at him. He flinched. It was microscopic. A slight widening of the eyes, a hesitation in his breath. But it was there. He released her hair abruptly, standing up as if he had touched something cold. She knows nothing, Cale muttered, turning away. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself. She is just a logistical rat. Throw her back. The heavy hauled her up. Sarah kept her body limp, dead weight, forcing him to carry her. As they dragged her out of the room, she kept her eyes on Cale's back. He was wiping his hand on his pants, as if to clean off something unseen. He's unsettled, she analyzed, as the darkness of the corridor swallowed her again. He senses the predator, but he can't see the teeth. She spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. Round one to me. Sarah hit the straw mat hard, her body still humming with the phantom sensation of Cale's fist. The heavy steel door clanged shut, the lock engaging with a finality that made the other hostages flinch. "They hurt you," Layla whispered, crawling over on hands and knees. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the swelling purple bruise radiating from Sarah's jawline. "Your face." Sarah caught Layla's wrist. The grip was gentle but firm, stopping the contact. "I'm fine," Sarah rasped. Her voice was thick, her mouth still tasting of copper and grit. "Go back to your corner, Layla. Don't let them see you helping me. It makes you a target." Layla hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, but she retreated. The hierarchy Sarah had established earlier held firm. They obeyed her, not out of fear, but out of a desperate need for someone to be in charge. Sarah rolled onto her side, facing the back wall of the cell. To the guards watching the monitors, if they were even watching, she was just another broken woman curling up to die. But Sarah was working. Her eyes locked onto the object she had cataloged 3 hours ago, a rusted iron bracket securing a vertical drainage pipe to the stone wall just inches above the floor. The pipe itself was useless, thick cast iron that vanished into the concrete. But the bracket was secured by 2 bolts that had been corroding in the sea air for decades. Weapon acquisition. She shifted her body, tucking her knees under her chin, and began to rock back and forth. A low, rhythmic moaning escaped her lips, a sound of pure misery to anyone listening. Under the cover of her body and the noise, her right hand snaked out. Her fingers found the bottom bolt. It was jagged with rust, cold and unyielding. She applied pressure, testing the torque. It didn't budge. It felt welded by time. Pain is fuel, she reminded herself. She dug her thumb into the side of the nut, pushing with every ounce of grip strength she possessed. The rough metal bit into her skin, tearing the callus, threatening to slice the pad of her thumb. She didn't stop. She synced her movements with her rocking. Push, rock, push, rock. Minutes turned into an hour. The sweat on her forehead wasn't from the heat anymore. It was from the exertion of isometric force. Her forearm burned as lactic acid flooded the muscle. Screech! A microscopic sound of metal shearing against rust. Sarah froze instantly. The rocking stopped. The moaning stopped. From the corridor, footsteps approached. The heavy. Sarah didn't pull her hand back. Sudden movement attracted the eye. Instead, she let her hand go limp against the pipe, looking like it had simply fallen there in her sleep. She buried her face in her knees. The flashlight beam swept over the cell. It lingered on the businessman, Ahmed, then tracked over to Sarah. The light held on her for 5 seconds. 5 seconds of holding her breath, willing her heart rate to slow so her carotid artery wouldn't pulse visibly against her neck. The light moved away. The footsteps receded. Sarah waited a full 2 minutes before moving. She resumed the rocking. She attacked the bolt again. This time, it gave. A quarter turn, half a turn. The rust crumbled, coating her fingers in a fine orange powder. With a final, silent twist, the nut came free. She palmed it, slipping it into her pocket. Now for the bracket itself. She worked the metal strip back and forth, fatiguing the iron. Bend, straighten, bend, straighten. The metal grew warm to the touch from the friction. Snap. The bottom half of the bracket broke off in her hand. It was ugly. It was jagged. It was a 4-inch strip of corroded iron, curved slightly, with a tip as ragged as a shark's tooth. It wasn't a knife. It was a shank, a tool for close-quarters butchery. Sarah examined it in the shadows, keeping it shielded from the camera's blind angle. She ran her thumb lightly over the jagged edge. It was dull, but the point was vicious. It would puncture a windpipe. It would sever an artery. She looked around the cell. Where to hide it? If they searched her again, the waistband was too obvious. The boot was compromised. Kyle knew about the tracker. He would check there first next time. She looked at her hair. It was long, matted with sweat and dirt, tied back in a messy bun with a thick, elastic band. Sarah undid the bun, shaking her hair loose. She slid the iron spike into the thickest part of her hair, flat against her scalp, and wove the strands around it, securing it tightly with the elastic. It was uncomfortable, a hard pressure against her skull, but invisible unless someone physically ran their fingers through her hair. She lay back down, her head resting gingerly on the straw. She closed her eyes, but the image of Cale's throat was burned onto the back of her eyelids. I am armed, she thought, the ghost of a smile touching her split lip. Come back when you're ready. Cale had been clever, but arrogant. He had found the GPS logger in the heel of her boot, a standard-issue commercial tracker used by logistics companies to monitor fleet movements. He had crushed it, believing he had severed her leash. He hadn't checked the inseam of her cargo pants. Sewn into the double-stitched fabric of the waistband, resting against the small of her back, was a Saber 2 beacon. It was no larger than a quarter, a flat disc of matte black polymer. It wasn't a passive tracker. It was an active burst transmitter. It didn't ping constantly. It only spoke when screamed at, and it needed a direct line of sight to the constellation of Milstar satellites orbiting 22,000 miles above. Sarah waited until the rotation shifted. 0314 Zulu. The heavy thud of boots overhead signaled the change. The heavy was gone. The kid was on duty. Sarah crawled over to Ahmed. The businessman was awake, staring blankly at the ceiling. He flinched when she touched his shoulder. "Ahmed," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I need you." He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What? Is it water? Do they have water?" "No. I need you to be a wall." She gestured to the corner of the cell, directly under the high, barred window. It was the only point in the room where the moonlight pierced the gloom. It was also directly in the blind spot of the hallway, provided the door remained closed. But inside the cell, a small, rusted camera housing sat in the opposite corner. It looked dead, the lens cracked, but Sarah couldn't take the risk. "Stand there," she ordered, pointing to a spot 3 feet from the wall. "Face the door, spread your jacket, do not move." Ahmed looked at her, confused and terrified. "Why? What are you doing?" "I'm calling the cavalry," she said. "But if you move, if you drop your arms, the camera sees me. If the camera sees me, we die. Do you understand?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he stood up. He positioned himself exactly where she pointed, opening his torn suit jacket like a curtain, blocking the line of sight from the camera to the corner. Sarah moved behind him. She reached into her waistband, ripping the seam with her fingernails. She pulled out the black disc. She looked up. The window was 8 feet off the ground. "Brace yourself," she whispered. She didn't ask for a boost. She stepped onto Ahmed's calf, then his thigh, moving with the lightness of a cat. He grunted under her weight, but held firm. She pulled herself up, wedging her toes into the cracks of the damp masonry, hanging by one hand from the iron bars of the window. The night air outside was cool. Through the grime-streaked glass, she could see a patch of stars, Orion's belt. Perfect. She pressed the disc against the glass. Her thumb found the recessed button in the center. She depressed it. One long hold, 2 short taps. SOS, Priority Alpha. A tiny LED on the rim of the disc blinked red. Acquiring satellite, Sarah held her breath. Her arm muscles screamed, the lactic acid from the earlier torture session returning with a vengeance. She was hanging by fingertips, suspended over a concrete floor, holding a piece of plastic worth more than her life. The LED blinked red again. "Come on," she urged silently. "Pick up." Outside, the faint sound of the kid lighting a cigarette drifted down. The clock was ticking. 90 seconds. She had been up here for 30. Blink. Red. Can I put my arms down?" Ahmed whispered from below, his voice straining. "No," she hissed. Blink. Green. Connection established. Sarah tapped in the code using the single button. It was a Morse-based shorthand, drilled into her since Bud-S VIPER. Lock confirmed. Hose 20+, Civ 12, execution imminent. She pressed the button for the final burst transmission. The light turned solid amber, sending. This was the danger zone. A burst transmission was short, mere milliseconds, but if Kale had a spectrum analyzer or a frequency jammer running, this would light up his boards like a flare in a dark room. 1 second, 2 seconds. The amber light died. Transmission complete. Sarah dropped. She landed silently on the balls of her feet, crouching instantly. She grabbed the disc, shoving it back into her waistband. "Sit down," she commanded Ahmed. They collapsed back onto the straw mats just as the sound of the key rattled in the lock. The door swung open. The kid stood there, a flashlight in one hand, a cigarette in the other. He swept the beam across the room. Ahmed was lying on his side, pretending to sleep. Sarah was curled in her corner, her chest heaving slightly, but her eyes closed. The beam lingered on the window. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Had he seen the shadow? Had he heard the scuff of boots on stone? The kid shrugged, exhaling a plume of smoke into the cell. "Quiet night," he muttered to no one, and slammed the door shut. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked at Ahmed in the dark. He was staring at her, his eyes wide. "Who are you really?" he mouthed. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The signal was out. The clock had started. But she knew something Ahmed didn't. A rescue mission took time. Planning, travel, insertion. 12 hours minimum. 24 likely. They didn't have 24 hours. She touched the rusted iron spike hidden in her hair. The cavalry was coming, but the slaughter would start before they arrived. She had to be the first wave. The silence in the cell following the signal transmission was heavier than before. It was no longer the silence of resignation. It was the silence of anticipation. The LED on the beacon had blinked green. Somewhere thousands of miles away, a screen in a secure operations center had lit up. Wheels were turning, rotors were spinning up, but Sarah knew the timeline. A Tier 1 QRF, Quick Reaction Force, based out of Djibouti or a carrier group in the Gulf, would take time to assemble and transit. Best case, 6 hours. Worst case, 12. Kyle wouldn't wait 12 hours. The interrogation had yielded nothing, and his patience was thinning. When he realized the secretary was a dead end, he would cut his losses. Sarah sat up. The slump in her shoulders vanished. The tremor in her hands ceased. She looked at the 11 people huddled in the dark with her. They were broken, starving, and terrified. But they were all she had. "Gather around," Sarah said. She didn't whisper this time. Her voice was low, but it carried a steel resonance that cut through the damp air like a blade. It wasn't a request. Ahmed, Layla, and the others looked at her, confused by the sudden shift in her demeanor. I said, "Gather around, now." Slowly, they crawled towards her, forming a tight circle in the center of the cell, away from the door's viewport. "The people holding us are not going to release us," Sarah began, her eyes locking with each of theirs in turn. "They are not negotiating. They are waiting for the right time to dispose of us." A collective whimper went through the group. One of the older men buried his face in his hands. "Stop!" Sarah snapped. "Panic kills. Tears kill. If you want to see your families again, you need to stop crying and listen." She pointed to the heavy iron door. "That door is the fatal funnel. When they come for us, and they will come, that doorway is where death lives. If you stand in front of it, you die. If you try to run through it before it's clear, you die." She grabbed a piece of loose limestone from the floor and began drawing on the concrete. "This is the cell. That is the door. When it opens, they will expect you to be cowering in the corners. That is what we have been doing. That is what prey does." She looked up, her face hard, the bruise on her jaw stark against her pale skin. "We are done being prey." "But we have no weapons," Layla whispered, clutching her rosary. "We are weak." "You have hands. You have teeth. You have mass," Sarah countered. She turned to Ahmed and 2 other men, fishermen with broad shoulders. "You 3, you are the wall. When that door opens, if I give the signal, you do not run away. You run at the door. You slam it back into them. You use your weight." She turned to Layla and the other women. "You stay low, below the waistline. Bullets travel at chest and head height. If the shooting starts, you are on your stomachs. You do not move until I say move. Do you understand?" "Who are you?" Ahmed asked again. But this time, there was no suspicion in his voice, only a desperate need for the answer to be true. "You are not logistic support." Sarah reached up and tightened the elastic band in her hair, feeling the reassuring pressure of the iron spike against her scalp. "No," she said. "I'm the janitor. I'm here to clean up the mess." She stood up, pacing the small circle. "From this moment on, nobody sleeps. Nobody talks. We watch the door. We watch the shadows under the door. If the shadow stops, we prep." She showed them how to strip the fabric from their shirts to wrap their fists. Poor man's brass knuckles to protect their hands if they had to punch bone. She showed them how to position themselves so they weren't bunched up, explaining fields of fire without using the technical term, simply telling them not to stack up where one bullet could hit two people. For the next hour, the cell transformed. The air of hopelessness evaporated, replaced by a brittle electric tension. They were still terrified. She could smell the ammonia-tinged sweat of fear, but they had a purpose. They had a plan. Sarah retreated to her position by the door hinge. She sat down, but her muscles were coiled. She was no longer suppressing the killer instinct. She was feeding it. She closed her eyes and visualized the corridor, the heavy, the kid, Cale. She played the scenario out in her mind, calculating angles, drag times, reload speeds. Come on, she thought, staring at the rust-pitted iron of the door. Open it. Make your move. As if in answer, the heavy bolt outside screeched. The cell went deathly still. It wasn't the rhythm of the patrol. It wasn't time for a check. Someone was unlocking the door. Sarah stood up, her back pressing against the wall next to the hinges, hidden from the initial view. She caught Ahmed's eye. He was trembling, but he nodded. He moved into position. The handle turned. The heavy iron door didn't just open. It was thrown back against the concrete wall with a violence that shook dust from the ceiling. Light flooded the cell, not the ambient gloom of the corridor, but the harsh, blinding beams of tactical flashlights mounted on rifles. Sterling pressed herself flat against the wall in the dead angle behind the door hinges. She held her breath, her heart rate deliberately slowed, her hand reaching up to the nape of her neck to grip the rusted iron spike hidden in her hair. Two figures stepped into the fatal funnel. First was the heavy. His PKM was leveled at the center of the room, sweeping back and forth over the huddled civilians. Behind him came Cale. The leader wasn't carrying a rifle. He held a pistol in one hand and a tablet in the other. They weren't here for a head count. "Get up," Cale barked, kicking Ahmed in the ribs. "All of you, against the wall." The civilians scrambled, panic threatening to break. The fragile discipline Sterling had instilled. But they remembered. They moved to the back wall, but Ahmed and the two fishermen stayed slightly forward, shielding the women. Sterling watched Cale from her hiding spot. He wasn't looking at the hostages. He was looking at the cell itself. He strode past the group, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, tracing the perimeter of the room. He stopped at the drainage pipe. The beam settled on the patch of fresh, bright orange rust where the bracket had been twisted off. The metal scar screamed in the darkness. "Someone has been busy," Cal whispered. The menace in his voice dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He turned slowly to face the hostages, his pistol raised. "Where is it?" Silence. "I said, where is it?" Kyle stepped toward Layla. He grabbed her by the hijab, jerking her head back. "Did you take it, little bird? Did you think you could make a knife?" Layla whimpered, her eyes darting toward the corner where Sterling was hidden. It was a reflex, a micro-expression of desperate hope, but Cale saw it. He didn't turn immediately. He was a predator, and predators sense when they are being hunted. He stiffened. The mistake. Cale had made the classic error of the arrogant jailer. He had entered the containment zone without clearing his corners. He assumed the threat was in front of him, cowering against the wall. He assumed he was the wolf in a pen of sheep. He had forgotten that sheepdogs also have teeth. Sterling saw the realization dawn on Cale's face. He began to pivot, his pistol tracking toward the dead space behind the door. Time to go. There was no dramatic battle cry. There was no warning. Sterling pushed off the wall, launching herself into the space between Cale and the heavy. She didn't go for the weapon. She went for the man. She slammed into Cale's side, her shoulder driving into his kidney. It wasn't a shove. It was a kinetic impact designed to displace organs. Cale grunted, his shot going wide, the bullet sparking off the stone floor. "Now!" Sterling screamed. The command triggered the civilians. The fear that had paralyzed them for days transmuted instantly into frantic, desperate action. Ahmed and the fishermen didn't fight with skill, but they fought with mass. They threw themselves at the heavy, grabbing the barrel of the machine gun, dragging him down by the sheer weight of 3 bodies. The heavy roared, his finger clamping down on the trigger. The PKM erupted. Dat, 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 dat. But the barrel was pointed at the ceiling. Concrete chips rained down like shrapnel, the noise deafening in the enclosed space. Sterling didn't watch them. Her world was Kale. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Kale was strong, wiry, and fast. He twisted, bringing the pistol around to fire at point-blank range. Sterling trapped his wrist with her left hand, driving it into the concrete. A shot rang out, deafeningly close to her ear, burning her neck with muzzle flash. She ripped the iron spike from her hair with her right hand. Kale saw the rusted metal. His eyes went wide, the first true look of terror she had seen on him. "You!" he gasped. "Surrender," Sterling hissed, echoing his words from the ambush. She drove the spike down. She didn't aim for the chest. Too much bone. She aimed for the soft hollow above the collarbone, the subclavian artery. The metal punched through skin and muscle. Kale's body arched, a guttural sound trapped in his throat. Blood, bright and arterial, sprayed across Sterling's face. She didn't stop. She twisted the spike, ensuring the damage was catastrophic, then ripped it free. Kal went limp, his hands scrabbling uselessly at his neck. Sterling rolled off him, snatching his pistol from the floor. She came up into a crouch, the weapon already up and scanning. The heavy was struggling, throwing the fisherman off him like rag dolls. He had managed to level the PKM again. Pop, pop. 2 shots from Sterling's stolen pistol, a Mozambique drill, 2 to the chest. The heavy staggered, his armor absorbing the rounds. He turned the machine gun toward her. Pop. The 3rd shot took him in the ocular cavity. The light behind his eyes went out. He collapsed backward, the machine gun clattering to the floor. Silence returned to the cell, ringing and absolute, broken only by the wet gurgle of Kale dying on the floor and the heavy breathing of the civilians. Sterling stood up. She wiped the blood from her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at the open door. The way was clear, but the noise, the gunfire. Every insurgent in the complex was waking up right now. "Get his gun," Sterling ordered Ahmed, pointing to the PKM. "We are leaving." The echo of the final shot that killed the heavy was still bouncing off the concrete walls when Sarah moved. She didn't pause to check Kale's body. He was dead. She had felt the life leave him through the vibration of the iron spike. She stepped over him, her boots sliding in the expanding pool of arterial blood, and moved to the heavy. Ahmed was standing over the massive corpse, clutching the PKM machine gun with trembling hands. He held it like a venomous snake, far away from his body, looking at Sarah with a mixture of horror and religious awe. "Don't look at him," Sarah barked, her voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. "Look at the door." She dropped to a knee beside the dead giant. She didn't want the PKM. It was too heavy, too unwieldy for the tight corners of the corridor, and she had no assistant gunner to manage the ammo belt. She needed speed. She ripped the tactical vest off the dead man, ignoring the gore. Inside the pouches, 3 spare magazines for the PKM, a fragmentation grenade, and a jagged combat knife. She took the grenade and the knife. Then she saw it. Slung across the heavy's back, beneath the machine gun strap, was a secondary weapon, a compact AK-74U, ideally suited for vehicle crews and close quarters. "Jackpot," she whispered. She freed the rifle, checked the chamber, loaded, and slapped the magazine to ensure it was seated. The familiar weight of the stamped steel receiver in her hands triggered a physiological shift. The trembling in her fingers vanished. Her breathing slowed to a combat rhythm. The secretary was gone. The victim was gone. Sarah Sterling stood up. She was covered in filth, sweat, and the blood of two men, holding a carbine with the ease of a limb she had just remembered she possessed. "Ahmed," she said, "that machine gun is heavy. Can you carry it?" I think so," the businessman stammered. "I didn't ask if you think so. I asked if you can. Pick it up. If we need suppressive fire, you pull the trigger, and you don't let go until the belt is empty. Do not aim, just point it down the hall." She turned to the rest of the hostages. They were pressed against the back wall, eyes wide. "Stay here. Do not come out until I call you." Sarah moved to the doorway. She didn't walk. She flowed. She sliced the pie at the threshold, minimizing her exposure, her rifle barrel leading her eyes. Contact. The kid was there. He was standing 10 meters down the corridor, near the stairwell, his rifle half raised, frozen in indecision. He had heard the shots, but he hadn't expected the silence that followed. He was expecting Cale to walk out. Instead, he saw a woman soaked in blood, stepping out of the darkness like a demon. Their eyes locked. For a split second, time dilated. Sarah saw the terror in his young face. He was maybe 19, a conscript, a boy who smoked too much and checked his phone on guard duty. In another life, she might have hesitated. In another life, she might have shouted for him to drop the weapon. But this wasn't a police action. This was survival. The kid started to raise his rifle. Sarah squeezed the trigger. Double tap. Crack, crack. The round struck him in the center mass. He folded backward without a sound, his rifle clattering to the floor. Sarah advanced. She didn't run. She moved with a rolling, predatory gait, keeping her upper body stable to maintain her sight picture. She stepped over the kid's body, checking the stairwell. Clear. She spun around, scanning the opposite end of the corridor. It ended in a dead end. The ventilation room. "Clear!" she shouted back at the cell. "Move! Now!" The civilians spilled out of the cell, stumbling over each other. Ahmed came last, dragging the heavy PKM, the ammo belt draped over his expensive suit like a grotesque sash. "Where are we going?" Layla cried, grabbing Sarah's arm. Sarah shook her off gently but firmly. "Up. The loading dock is 2 floors above us. That's the only way out." "But there will be more of them," Ahmed panted. "Yes," Sarah said, checking the selector switch on her AK-74U. "There will be." She looked at the group. They were terrified, uncoordinated, and loud. A tactical liability in every sense. But they were alive. "Listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a low growl. "The men who held you are dead. The men upstairs don't know that yet. Confusion is our weapon. We are going to move fast, and we are going to be violent. If you see someone with a gun who isn't me or Ahmed, you scream." She turned back to the stairs. The adrenaline was coursing through her, sharpening her vision until the world looked high definition. She felt a dark, grim satisfaction coiling in her gut. They had taken her comms. They had taken her dignity. They had beaten her. But they had made one critical error. They had let her wake up. "Stay close," she whispered into the gloom of the stairwell. "We're hunting." The stairwell ended at a heavy industrial fire door. The paint was peeling, revealing layers of rust that looked like dried blood. Sterling pressed her ear against the cold metal. Voices, shouting. The gunshots downstairs had kicked the hive. "Listen to me," Sterling hissed, turning to the group huddled on the landing below her. "Through this door is the main processing floor. It's a maze of conveyor belts and machinery. We move fast. Stay low. If I stop, you stop. If I shoot, you get flat." She looked at Ahmed. The businessman was sweating profoundly. the heavy PKM machine gun shaking in his grip. "Ahmed, when I open this door, I need you to spray the far wall. Just pull the trigger for 3 seconds. Can you do that?" "Yes," Ahmed wheezed. "Yes." "Good. On my mark." Sterling took a deep breath, centering herself. She kicked the release bar and shoved the door open. "Now!" Ahmed stepped out and unleashed hell. The PKM roared, a deep, thumping bass that vibrated in the chest cavities of everyone nearby. He didn't aim. He just held the trigger down, the belt feeding rounds into the chamber, the muzzle climbing toward the ceiling. Bullets chewed up the drywall and smashed into the metal catwalks above, sending showers of sparks raining down. It was sloppy, untrained fire. It was also perfect suppression. "Move! Move! Move!" Sterling screamed, grabbing Layla by the collar and shoving her forward. The hostages spilled onto the warehouse floor. It was a cavernous space filled with rusted canning machinery and stacks of wooden crates. The air was thick with dust, kicked up by Ahmed's barrage. The militia, caught off guard by the wall of lead, had scrambled for cover. But now, the PKM clicked dry, or jammed. Ahmed didn't know how to clear it. "Get down!" Sterling tackled Ahmed, dragging him behind a stack of pallets just as the return fire started. Crack-thwack, crack-thwack. Rounds slammed into the wood, sending splinters flying. Sterling popped up, her AK-74U shouldered tight. She saw muzzle flashes from the upper gantry. Target identified. Range, 40 meters. Elevation, plus 115 degrees. She exhaled and squeezed. Pop, pop. A gunman on the catwalk crumpled, toppling over the railing and hitting the concrete floor with a wet thud. "Right side, flanking!" Sterling yelled. 3 tangos were moving through the machinery on the east wall, trying to get an angle on the civilians. Sterling left the cover of the pallets, sprinting into the open to draw their fire. She was a blur of motion, firing on the move. She dropped one man behind a conveyor belt. The second ducked. The third fired a burst that tore through the air inches from her head. Sterling slid into a crouch behind a forklift, changing magazines. "Go! Head for the big doors!" she shouted at the civilians. They scrambled, crawling on hands and knees toward the massive loading bay doors at the far end of the hall. They were exposed, vulnerable. Then it happened. One of the fishermen, the one who had helped tackle the guard earlier, stood up too soon. He panicked, trying to run instead of crawl. A single shot rang out from the shadows. The fisherman's leg kicked out from under him as if yanked by a rope. He hit the ground hard, screaming, clutching his thigh where a dark stain was rapidly spreading. "I'm hit! Help me!" he shrieked. The group froze. They looked back. "Keep moving," Sterling ordered, breaking from cover. She sprinted back toward the wounded man. Bullets danced around her feet, chipping the concrete. She reached him, grabbing his tactical vest, stolen from the guards, and hauled him up. "Up! On one leg! Move!" she grunted, wrapping her arm around his waist. He was heavy, dead weight, dragging his injured leg. Sterling fired her AK one-handed with her free arm, suppressing the shadows as she dragged him backward. "Ahmed! The gun!" she screamed. Ahmed, seeing them exposed, fumbled with the PKM. He didn't know how to reload, but he grabbed the barrel, burning his hands, and swung it like a club, smashing it against the metal crates to make noise, to draw attention. It worked. The distraction bought Sterling the 3 seconds she needed. She threw the wounded fisherman behind the heavy steel blast doors of the loading dock. The rest of the group was already there, huddled in the alcove. Sterling dived in after them, spinning around to slam the locking mechanism. Ping, ping, ping. Bullets hammered the other side of the steel door a fraction of a second after it sealed. They were out of the warehouse. They were in the loading bay. Sterling slid down the wall, gasping for air. Her lungs burned, her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. She looked at the fisherman. He was pale, shock setting in. The femoral artery wasn't hit. Too little blood for that. But the femur was likely shattered. "Layla," Sterling said, tossing her Shema to the woman. "Tie this above the wound. Tight as you can." She checked her magazine, half empty, one spare left. She looked at the external bay doors. Through the cracks, she could see the night sky. And beyond that, the flashing lights of the port city. They weren't safe yet. They had just moved from the frying pan into the fire. "Everyone up," Sterling commanded, her voice devoid of pity. "We aren't done." The external loading bay door was a corrugated sheet of steel, operated by a manual chain hoist. Sterling grabbed the rusted chain, her muscles screaming in protest. "When this opens," she yelled over the ringing in her ears, "we run for the shipping containers on the left. Do not stop in the open. Do not look back." She hauled on the chain. The gears ground together, screeching like banshees. The door rose 6 inches, then a foot. Cool, salty night air rushed in, displacing the stench of the warehouse. But with the air came light. Headlights. Twin beams cutting through the darkness, positioned directly in front of the ramp. Sterling dropped the chain. "Down!" She threw herself on top of Layla just as the world exploded. It wasn't the sharp crack of small arms. It was the deep, chest-thumping thump, thump, thump of a heavy-caliber weapon. A DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun mounted on the back of a Toyota Technical. The rounds punched through the corrugated steel door as if it were wet paper. They slammed into the concrete walls of the loading bay, blowing out chunks of masonry the size of dinner plates. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic jackhammer that drowned out the screams of the hostages. "Stay down! Stay tight!" Sterling roared, pressing herself into the floor. They were pinned. The enemy gunner was simply shredding the exit, turning the loading bay into a kill box. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't go back. Sterling checked her AK-74U. 7 rounds, maybe 8. Against a vehicle-mounted heavy machine gun and armored plating, she might as well be throwing rocks. She looked at the civilians. They were huddled in the corner, covered in gray dust, their faces masks of absolute terror. The wounded fisherman was losing consciousness. Ahmed was curled into a ball, praying. If she stayed here, the DSHK would chew through the wall eventually, or they would flank the warehouse and toss grenades inside. She needed a hammer. Sterling reached into her pocket and pulled out the Saber 2 beacon. She held it up, checking the status. Solid green. The signal was locked. They are here. They just can't see us. The warehouse roof was metal shielding. The drone or chopper overhead would see the heat signature of the Technical, but they wouldn't fire without a positive ID on the friendlies to avoid collateral damage. They needed a mark. Sterling looked at the gap under the partially raised door. The headlights of the truck were blinding. She looked at Layla. "Keep them here." "Where are you going?" Layla screamed, grabbing Sterling's wrist. "You'll die!" Sterling pulled her hand away. Her expression was calm, almost serene. It was the face of a woman who had done the math and accepted the remainder. "Cover your ears," Sterling said. She stood up. She didn't crawl. She didn't sneak. She sprinted. Sterling charged the gap in the door, sliding underneath the jagged metal like a baseball player stealing home. She tumbled out onto the asphalt of the loading dock, rolling directly into the glare of the headlights. The DHK gunner saw the movement. The turret traversed, the barrel spitting flame. Thump, thump, thump. Rounds tore up the asphalt inches from her boots, sending razor-sharp gravel spraying into her face. Sterling scrambled to her feet and ran to the right, away from the shipping containers where she had told the civilians to go. She was the rabbit. She was drawing the wolf away from the flock. She raised her AK-74U and fired her last burst directly at the truck's windshield. The glass didn't break, but it spiderwebbed, blinding the driver. The gunner screamed, swinging the heavy barrel to track her. Sterling dived behind a stack of empty oil drums just as the 12.78 rounds shredded them. Liquid, rainwater, and sludge exploded over her. She was pinned. No ammo, no cover left. The gunner corrected his aim, walking the fire toward her position. This is it, she thought. She curled tight, protecting her head. Then she heard it. It wasn't the gun. It was a sound she felt in her teeth before she heard it with her ears. A high-pitched whine that rapidly deepened into a thundering roar. Rotors. From the darkness above the harbor, a dark shape materialized. It was sleek, predatory, and terrifyingly fast. An MH-60 Seahawk, blacked out, running silent until the last second. A voice crackled in her ear. Not through an earpiece, but from the Voice of God loudspeaker on the bird. Visual on friendly, danger close, get down. Sterling buried her face in the dirt. Whoosh! A Hellfire missile left the rail of the helicopter. The flight time was less than a second. The impact was a physical blow. The shock wave lifted Sterling off the ground and slammed her back down. The heat washed over her, instant and searing. When she opened her eyes, the technical was gone. In its place was a burning skeleton of twisted metal and a crater in the asphalt. The heavy machine gun fell silent. The Seahawk banked hard, its downdraft kicking up a storm of dust and debris. It hovered 10 feet off the deck, the side door sliding open. Sterling pushed herself up. She was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, deafened and shaking. But she stood. She turned back to the warehouse door. "Move!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Get to the bird!" The world inside the rotor wash was a violent, monochromatic storm of dust and noise. The MH-60 Seahawk hovered just inches above the asphalt, its landing gear compressing slightly under the weight of the beast. The side door was open, revealing the cavernous dark belly of the aircraft and two crew chiefs, faceless men in ballistic helmets and visors, waving frantically. "Go! Go! Go!" Sterling screamed, though her voice was lost in the turbine roar. She grabbed Ahmed by the back of his ruined suit jacket and shoved him toward the open door. The businessman stumbled forward, blinded by the grit, dragging the wounded fisherman with him. The crew chiefs reached out, grabbing the men by their belts and hauling them inside like sacks of cargo. They slid across the diamond plate floor, slick with hydraulic fluid and oil. Sterling turned back. The loading dock was empty. The burning wreckage of the technical cast long dancing shadows against the warehouse walls, except for one figure. Layla was standing 10 feet from the ramp. She wasn't moving toward the helicopter. She was looking back at the warehouse, her hair whipping around her face, her expression one of shattered devastation. "Layla!" Sterling sprinted back to her, grabbing her shoulder. "Move!" "My brother!" Layla screamed, her voice barely audible over the engines. She pointed back at the black maw of the blast door. "He was in the first cell. We left him." Sterling froze for a microsecond. She remembered the first cell. She remembered scanning it on the way out. It had been empty. The men in there had been executed days ago. "He's not there, Layla," Sterling yelled, leaning close to her ear. "He's gone." "No, I won't leave him." Layla fought Sterling's grip, her fingernails digging into Sterling's forearm. She tried to pull away, to run back into the kill zone. From the helicopter, a red light flashed in the cabin. The pilot was signaling, launch or leave. They were taking sporadic small arms fire from the tree line now, rounds pinging off the fuselage like angry hail. Sterling looked at the pilot. She looked at the darkness of the warehouse. She looked at Layla. There was no time for grief counseling. There was no time for gentleness. Sterling released Layla's arm and grabbed her by the tactical vest she had scavenged. With a grunt of exertion, Sterling lifted the woman off her feet. Layla kicked and screamed, striking at Sterling's face, but Sterling didn't flinch. She drove forward, carrying the civilian like a tackle dummy. She reached the door gunner's station. The crew chief saw what was happening. He didn't ask questions. He reached out, grabbed Layla's vest, and yanked her into the cabin, pinning her to the floor as she thrashed. "Clear!" The chief screamed into his headset, giving a thumbs up. Sterling stepped onto the running board. She didn't sit. She stood on the skids, grabbing the handle above the doorframe, her AK-74U held in her free hand, pointed back at the chaos they were leaving. "Dust off! Dust off!" The pitch of the turbine screamed higher. The bird lurched, the nose dipping slightly as it bit into the air. The ground fell away instantly. 10 feet, 50 feet, 200. The burning technical became a toy. The warehouse became a shoebox. The port city of Al-Fayed spread out below them, a grid of yellow lights and dark shadows, indifferent to the violence that had just occurred. Sterling watched the loading dock shrink. She saw muzzle flashes from the perimeter fence. The rest of the militia finally arriving to find their prize gone. Tracers floated up toward them, lazy arcs of green light that burned out long before they reached the altitude of the helicopter. Inside the cabin, the adrenaline crash hit the civilians. Ahmed was vomiting into a bag handed to him by a medic. The wounded fisherman was already hooked up to an IV, a tourniquet cranked tight around his thigh. Layla was curled in a ball near the transmission wall, sobbing into her hands. Sterling didn't join them. She stayed on the edge of the open door, wind whipping her blood-matted hair. She scanned the horizon, her eyes locked on the threat sectors, her finger resting on the trigger guard. The crew chief tapped her on the shoulder, offering her a headset. Sterling took it, sliding it over her ears. The roar of the wind was replaced by the crackle of the pilot's voice. "Viper 1-1, this is Kingfish. Welcome aboard, ma'am. We have you. We're taking you home." Sterling didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands. They were black with grime, red with dried blood, and trembling slightly now that the need for absolute stillness was gone. She looked at the civilians, people she had terrorized, choked, and bullied in order to save. They were alive. They would hate her for how she did it, but they were alive. "Copy, Kingfish," Sterling replied, her voice flat, metallic, and utterly exhausted. "Status is Winchester. All objectives secure." She leaned her head back against the vibrating metal frame of the door. She didn't close her eyes. The water in the shower drain swirled pink. It took 20 minutes of scrubbing with a stiff, bristled brush and industrial soap to remove the layers of grime, oil, and dried blood from her skin. The physical filth washed away, but the phantom sensation of the warehouse, the damp cold, the smell of fear, the vibration of the iron spike hitting bone remained etched into her nerve endings. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Sterling turned off the faucet. She stepped out onto the cold tile of the infirmary bathroom at Camp Lemonnier, wrapping a thin white towel around herself. She looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger. Her left eye was swollen shut, a blooming kaleidoscope of purple and black. Her lip was split and stitched. Her ribs were taped, but it was the eyes that unsettled her. They were flat, dead things, the eyes of a shark that hadn't eaten enough. "Commander?" The voice came from the other side of the door. It was the medical officer. "Coming," Sterling said. Her voice was rasping, her throat raw from the smoke and the screaming. She dressed in clean fatigues, no rank insignia, just sterile tan fabric. She walked out into the exam room. The air conditioning was humming loudly, a stark contrast to the silence of the cell. "Your vitals are stable," the doctor said, not looking up from his tablet. "You have multiple contusions, a grade 2 concussion, and dehydration. I'm recommending 48 hours of mandatory downtime before you fly back to Virginia." "Noted," Sterling said. "Am I cleared for the debrief?" "Physically? Yes. Psychologically, that's not my call." Sterling didn't answer. She walked out. The debriefing room was a windowless box in the intelligence sector of the base. A CIA case officer and a naval intelligence captain were waiting. A pot of coffee sat on the table, sweating condensation. "Sit down, Commander," the captain said. Sterling sat. She didn't slouch. She didn't lean back. She sat with her spine perfectly straight, hands resting on her thighs. "Walk us through the timeline," the CIA officer said, clicking a pen. "Starting from the ambush." Sterling spoke for an hour. She stripped the narrative of emotion. She didn't describe the terror of the civilians or the smell of Kale's breath. She described vectors, timetables, caloric intake, guard rotations, and structural weaknesses. She turned a nightmare into a spreadsheet. "And the HVT, Kale?" the officer asked. "Neutralized," Sterling said. "Improvised puncture wound to the subclavian artery. Confirmed kill." The two men exchanged a glance. It was a look Sterling knew well. It was the look men gave when they realized the woman across from them was not a victim, but a butcher. "And the civilians?" 13 hostages. 12 extracted. 1 KIA prior to my arrival, Sterling lied smoothly. Layla's brother had been dead long before she got there, but the paperwork was cleaner this way. "Mr. Thorne is secure?" "He is," the captain nodded. "He's in the mess hall. He asked to see you." Sterling stood up. "Are we done, sir?" "For now." She found Thorne sitting alone at a metal table, staring into a plastic cup of water. He was wearing clean clothes, but he looked smaller than he had in the cell. When he saw her, he stood up quickly, knocking his chair back. "Sarah," he said. He looked at her face, at the bruising, and flinched. "God, I didn't know if you made it." "I made it," she said. Thorne reached out, taking her hand. His grip was soft, shaking slightly. "I don't know what to say. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just a logistical contractor," she finished for him. "You saved us. You saved everyone." He paused, his eyes searching hers for some sign of humanity, some spark of the shared trauma. "Thank you." Sterling looked at him. She felt the weight of his gratitude, and she felt absolutely nothing. It was like watching a movie through thick glass. He was going back to his world of NGOs and diplomatic receptions. She was staying in hers. "You're welcome, Mr. Thorne," she said. She pulled her hand away gently. "Get some sleep." She turned and walked away before he could say anything else. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want his awe. She walked back to the transient barracks assigned to Spec War personnel. The room was empty, rows of bunk beds standing like skeletons in the dim light. Sterling sat on the edge of her bunk. She reached into her duffel bag and pulled out her gear, her holster, her knife. She began to clean them. She wiped down the polymer, checked the springs, oiled the steel. It was a ritual, a grounding exercise, on your knees. The words echoed in her mind, faint now, like a radio transmission losing signal. She had been on her knees. She had been humiliated. She had been beaten, and she had turned it all into a weapon. Sterling snapped her holster shut. She lay back on the pillow, staring at the mattress above her. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't need to sleep. She just needed to wait. The phone would ring. The light would blink green, and she would do it all again. Because the sheep were safe in their beds, and someone had to stand in the dark to keep the wolves away. Even if the sheep never knew her name,